Good morning, World History class. This is Mrs. Politsky, and these are your notes for Chapter 26, Sections 1 and 2. If you have your guided notes, you will need to find those to follow along. All right, take a look at question number 1, or statement number 1. Europe was on the brink of war in the year 1914 due to rising tensions resulting from militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, or also known as the main causes, MAIN, for the First World War. Item number 2. The Triple Alliance was made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And this was an alliance that came about prior to the beginning of World War I. Then there was also the Triple Entente. That was made up of Great Britain, France, and Russia. The purpose of forming such groups of allies would be to ensure that if one nation were attacked, its allies would join to defend them, resulting in a larger war. Number 3, World War I broke out when Austria-Hungary blamed the Serbs for the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, leading to a war between both countries' allies. On June the 28th, 1914, Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by a young Serbian named Gavrilo Princip. Franz Ferdinand had been visiting the city of Sarajevo, and Princip was a member of a terrorist group called the Black Hand. Austria-Hungary decided to use the murder as an excuse to punish Serbia. They were given roughly a 30-day ultimatum. Ultimately, war was declared 1 month later on July 28, 1914. Russia supported Serbia and had promised to support the Serbs if they had been attacked. So, some scenes here of the assassination. This is kind of an unusual event because now we have the beauty of photography, and some of those events of that day were actually recorded on film. But this drawing here kind of shows you what happened. Princip had stepped out of the crowd with his handgun. Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia were both shot that day. Were riding in the back of an open-air car or a limo. And Princip just walked up to the car and shot them both point blank. And the next thing you know, we've got war. Yes. All right. Moving on to section 2. Oh, before that, I want to talk a little bit about the World War I alliances. And somewhere on a piece of scratch paper or off to the margins here, I want to mention these. We had talked about the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, but for some strange reason, these are not necessarily the same teams that we're going to see when the war begins. Okay, the Central Powers are basically what we would probably define as the enemies. This would be made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and eventually the Ottoman Empire. And if you remember back to the Triple Alliance, we have the first two correct, but it's the Ottoman Empire, which is something new. Italy had once been a part of the Triple Alliance, and for some reason they're not going to go along with the Central Powers during this war. The Allies, aka what was once known as the Triple Entente, are made of Great Britain and also under the crown Australia and Canada, France, Russia, and in time, eventually, you're going to see Italy and eventually the United States. All right, we're going to take a look at section 2 of chapter 26, a new kind of war, and we're going to kind of talk a little bit about some of the weaponry and why World War I was a little different than previous wars. So take a look at number 1. The term no man's land comes from the dangerous open area between the trenches. When the war began in 1914, it was assumed that this would be a pretty quick war because The Industrial Revolution had kind of given us a lot of new technology, and I think people just assumed that this thing would all be wrapped up within a matter of weeks. Unfortunately, the technology was so good on both sides, or all sides, that it just kind of drags things out a little bit longer. Troops ended up having to dig trenches. The trenches became fortified. As a way to get people out of the trenches, we had to come up with better weaponry. Machine guns, that was something that kind of was coming about prior to the war. Artillery or the howitzers, we had seen some of those kind of things in previous wars leading up to World War One. But eventually, we're going to need something to break people out of the trenches. And that kind of leads us into number two. As a result of the stalemate, new technologies such as gas warfare, tanks, and aircraft were developed. The man who is responsible, or kind of the father, a chemical worker, was a guy named Fritz Haber, and he was actually from Germany. And this guy is kind of a weird situation. He is credited for developing some of the new chemicals used for developing fertilizers. Okay, and he won a Nobel Prize in chemistry, I think in 1915. But the deal is, he's also the man who developed Zyklon B. You guys know what Zyklon B is used for? In the concentration camps. Okay, and Fritz himself was actually Jewish. Okay, and when the Second World War comes around, some of his family are going to be put to death in the gas chambers using the chemical that he developed. So it's crazy. During World War One, he was really a zealot German. I mean, he was pro-Germany, trying to do everything he could to help the fatherland. So gas warfare was used. The battle, I think, of Second Ypres was basically the battle that they used it in. The Germans said that they weren't the first to use it. It was the French that used it in a battle prior to that, but then the Germans started using it. Next thing you know, everyone's using it. Okay, to buzz people out of the trenches, we start using tanks. We mentioned a little something about how dangerous those were the other day. Aircraft, which were used for surveillance, now start dropping bombs on people. Not necessarily anything huge, but eventually it's going to become far more sophisticated. Other things that you're going to see, the use of submarines and U-boats. If you're going to have gas warfare, you're going to have gas mask, and even this horse has a gas mask, which is pretty cool. Using secret codes, our blimps, all of those kind of things are going to be widely used during this battle. All right, number 3 and number 4. Propaganda and censorship were used during the war because it could unify people to support the war effort, but it also kept people from knowing the true extent of what was happening. And number 4, on the Western Front, which would be basically what would be parts of France and Belgium, France and Germany suffered enormous casualties in the battles of Verdun and the Somme. The Germans defeated the British in the Third Battle of Ypres along the front lines, eventually became relatively unchanged. That's where we get into talking about wars of attrition, where you are literally fighting for inches and not necessarily for miles. Number 5 and number 6. In World War I, it was truly a world war because over 30 nations officially took sides. And the war was fought in Europe, Asia, the Pacific, which I think a lot of people forget about, and also on the continent of Africa. The war stalemate influenced warring nations because they had to look elsewhere for ways to win this war. All right. Number 7 and number 8. Special defensive position controlled by the Ottoman Empire was a place called the Dardanelles. Dardanelles is this area right here. It's not very far from the Aegean Sea, if you can look here on this little map, and the Black Sea. And the Russians, obviously, and the British were concerned about this waterway. They were upset that the Ottoman would probably control it. And so they sent British troops here to take over the strait. And what results is something called the Battle of Gallipoli. The Battle of Gallipoli was a real bloodbath for the most part. The Ottoman had the highland, the British and their allies had the lowlands, and it went on and on and on, and there were lots of casualties. It was really pretty much a mistake on the behalf of the British. All right. Other things that happened, aerial bombings, which was something new. If you can take a look at this steel structure, this is something that was probably likely bombed um, using either artillery or such. And the fact that we've got civilians that are still sitting in the middle of this. All right. Make sure that you've got all your information written down, and next time we're together, we'll probably talk about the Russian Revolution.